do you see CFC headed in the next 2 to 4 years? What might be the main challenges and opportunities? And if perhaps we can start with General Brooks, sir, and then move on to General Lim, and then Mr. Bruce Klingner afterwards. So General Brooks, sir, please.
Well, thanks a lot, Dr. Cho. And I think the answers to the last questions were excellent by Bruce Klingner and Im Ho Young. Very insightful. So I think the way we're going now is first that the spirit of combinedness will carry forward into the future. And that as we get closer to the conditions for the transfer of operational control of forces in wartime being met, as Bruce and General Lee laid out, that preservation of combinedness will be a must. And I believe that that spirit will still be there. There will be discussions about the role of United Nations Command and the force levels of US Forces Korea and whether that signals a change or a potential reduction. I believe that those are separate conversations that are not related to the transfer of operational control of forces in wartime. The issue of sovereignty, I think, will resolve itself as people begin to look more deeply into this and realize that the sovereignty has already been granted. It's the day-to-day conditions under armistice. Now, compliance with the armistice certainly is impacted by UN command, but the control of forces and the command of forces on a day-to-day basis is in the hands of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Minister of Defense. So I think that realization will come out, and it should become less of a political issue than it is right now. The actual composition of the force, I think, will evolve. I'm certainly of the view that the lower levels of the command should become increasingly combined and ideally stand in a combined fashion on a day-to-day basis. But those things will be determined by the commanders in position at the time and the minister secretaries at the time through the security consultation meeting. And so I think continued progress is what we're going to see over the next several years related toward the conditions. And ideally, success in deterring North Korea from a resumption of war. That's its primary mission, and that has to be the case until such time as there is peace on the Korean Peninsula. And then new discussions can begin, but that's not within 2 years, I don't believe. So thanks again.
Thank you, sir. And General Lim Ho Young, please, could you share us your comments and thoughts? Thank you.
앞으로 한 2년에서 4년 이후의 연합사의 모습은
the futures of CFC 2 to 4 years later is very closely related to the wartime OPCON transition. First, during the wartime, the operation control, who's going to do that in the CFC? We have to think about that. And the second is that the two countries' national or political situation is very important factor to think about. In South Korea, when the Moon Jae-in administration began, there was a misunderstanding about the wartime OPCON. So there were saying that the wartime OPCON was related to the sovereignty of South Korea. So Moon administration in the beginning of the presidency says that like within the presidency, South Korea will actually recover or they will receive the wartime OPCON. But in the case of the US, I think the security situation is different. In the past, the relations between the US and China was good, that I can say, but now both countries are having a rivalry situation. So this situation may affect the future of the CFC, including the wartime OPCON transfer. So the US political situation can play a very important role. So in 2 to 4 years later, I think the future of the CFC will be dependent on whether or not a wartime OPCON transfer will be done, and the second, the situation of the East Asian countries, and at the third one is the situation of the US politics. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And last but not least, Mr. Bruce Klingner.
Great, thanks. I'd like to make 4 points. Looking to the future of CFC, one obviously is the biggest issue is OPCON transition. So not only fulfilling the actual requirements, but then dealing with a lot of incorrect perceptions in both South Korea and the United States. Second, I think we have to do things to address the potential South Korean concerns about an unzipping of the alliance once we switch chairs on the commander and the deputy commander. And also a lot of increasing questions about the viability of the U.S. as an ally. So, that has been a result of the, in my view, exorbitant demands by the U.S. For special measures agreement negotiations, the threats to reduce our forces if we don't get sufficient money. But also even before that, as North Korea was increasingly developing the capability to attack the United States, the homeland, with nuclear weapons, I increasingly heard in Seoul and Tokyo, like, would you really sacrifice San Francisco for Seoul or Toledo for Tokyo? And we'd had to try to reassure them, yes, we have extended deterrence guarantee, we have a treaty guarantee, et cetera. But I think that may increasingly be an issue as we get closer to actual transition. The third issue would be delineating the relationship between Combined Forces Command and UNC. And I think a lot of things that KDVA has done is try to explain that. So, it was easy when the US commander wore all 3 hats. He just sort of had to choose which stationary he issued his orders on. But when the South Koreans assumes CFC command, the relationship between CFC and UNC becomes a bit more perhaps uncertain and confusing. So would a South Korean CFC commander interact with and delineate responsibilities with UNC, including non-US sending forces? Would the South Korean CFC commander command non-US forces on the peninsula? Who controls UN naval forces beyond 12 nautical miles from the shores, et cetera? So there are a number of things that I think are more confusing or at least need to be delineated once the transition occurs or before. Fourth and finally would be defining the future of the alliance. So certainly North Korea is the wolf closest to the sled. We want to focus on that. It's going to continue to be the predominant threat. But we also need to look over the horizon beyond the Korean Peninsula, as Korea has done for many years. But I think as South Korea continues to improve its military capabilities, Seoul would be and should be called upon to assume greater responsibility, particularly in the region. So South China Sea areas where South Korea is reliant on sea lines of communication for its oil deliveries and other economic activities. So it's in South Korea's interest to have free and open sea lines of communication. So I think the U.S. has been asking for South Korea to do more in the South China Sea. So, as we not only respond to North Korea, but looking to the China threat as well as other threats.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let us move to some of the audience questions for our remaining 10 or 12 minutes. And first off, one question from the audience: how to best provide analysis to policymakers on OPCON transition. This, I think, important, especially as we all understand with the transition to a new administration in Washington. General Brooks, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's really important that those who help to shape policy and to shape ideas about the alliance have a clarity of their own that they then communicate to others. It shouldn't be assumed that the clarity is complete within the halls of government. And I don't say that to be facetious or negative, it's simply true. So these matters we've talked about on equating OPCON transition to sovereignty or OPCON transition to the Pershing rule and subordination, as Bruce talked about, those are incorrect and they're held in government. So there's a need for those to look at it objectively outside of government to help inform the dialogue within government on exactly what it is and what it is not. And I believe that's the role to be played. There's also a need to communicate publicly in writings, in webinars like this, what the differences are, what the frictions are, the hindrances, and what the needs are. And so today we hope that that has gone a step toward that direction.